Thank you very much, Sujit, for that, I think, very important lecture. As John McNee knows very well, Sujit and I are old friends, and we've often worked in the same contexts. And the issue of group rights, I think Sujit has stripped it down to sort of threadbare. If I can use the word, not Marxist, but Marxian, this analysis, by stripping it down to essentially that being of economic interests and using political power not for power, but power to control resources or to access resources. That's am I correct in?
Yes, absolutely.
In
I know. I mean, it's fun. I mean, it is a bit. Every kind of way of approaching an issue has the danger of being reductive, right? And so part of the reaction I had was to a kind of strong cultural reading of every conflict you see by very serious scholars, often kind of shaped by their national experience, right? And Canadians are particularly guilty of this. When we go to kind of other places, we kind of bring a lens that's shaped by our experiences that isn't entirely helpful all the time. And so it's not always about identity and culture, is what I've learned the hard way.
But I think the point you make about having access to power and having access to economic resources is important, because for those of us who work in the field, you really need something to hang your hat on in terms of finding solutions for these problems. I mean, in political science theory, when people talk about political culture, it's almost sort of a reductionist, not a reductionist, but a sort of a surplus category for trying to explain things that can't otherwise be explained. But I think you hit the, as you know, in Sri Lanka, in Tunisia, where there were regional differences over access to economic resources, that triggered a particular political reaction. But how would you characterize the way group rights plays out in, say, a country like Egypt, which isn't culturally or ethnically heterogeneous?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about Egypt. We should probably also talk about Nepal as well. Sure. We've both been working there, and Canada's been engaged there for many years. So in Egypt, so what is at the root of, it's a horribly complicated place. It's incredibly polarized. It arguably is polarized between two different, kind of a secular elite and a set of elites, if we can call it that, organized around religion, who disagree fundamentally on the nature of the relationship between religion and state. And there's no doubt that that is an element to what is at stake in Egypt. It is by no means the only issue, okay? So if when you think about what sparked the Egyptian revolution, people will talk about corruption. People will talk about clientelism. People will talk about patronage. And one way to understand the kind of the competition between the Fulul, right, the elite kind of organized around the Mubarak state and what's come out of this, and the Brotherhood is between different economic elites, one of whom had privileged access to the state and its largesse and the resources that came from political connections through licenses. So we know how telecoms, right, think about India, right, can be a tool for patronage and underwriting political coalitions, and one group didn't, and largely had to operate outside without the benefit of that. And so the claim for kind of an inclusive economic model, where people can kind of get along and not have to resort to political connections to get a bank loan, is in a huge element of what was at the root of many of the Arab Spring revolutions. Is it the only issue? Of course not. Is it the only issue now? Of course not. But it's something that we ignore, at our peril through kind of a monochromatic and totalizing focus just on an obvious and very visible type of conflict between a party organized around Islam and a party that seems to reject it.
It's interesting what you say, because in Tunisia, where both you and I have worked, one of the things that struck me when I first went there after transition, and we talked about democracy, talked to some of the locals there. I asked one young fellow what it meant, what democracy meant for him. Yeah. And his response was very interesting. It wasn't about the vote, it wasn't about self-determination. It was about the fact that his family owned a salt business. and that they had difficulty getting licenses to expand because they weren't
connected.
Exactly.
No WhatsApp.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Again, your issue about Egypt is quite pertinent. Yeah. There's someone here who walked in late, but somebody of Egyptian origin who pointed out to me that one of the key reasons that the Brotherhood lost its support was that they tinkered with the economic aspects of people's life in a negative way, appointing an Islamist governor of Luxor, which is sort of a key tourist town. So I think in that sense, you've really sort of hit the nail on the head. Yeah. But you wanted to talk a little bit about Nepal.
A bit about Nepal. So, Nepal is a place where you've worked extensively, where I've done some work. And so there has been, one of the, I think Nepal is a great case study of how to not give international support to a constitution building process. I mean, it's been a mess. And it's not nearly just because of all of us who kept on going there, but we have some role or some responsibility. And I think the reason is that, what basically happened is that a lot of experts would come to Nepal, Swiss experts, Canadian experts, and talk about federalism. We bring our lens, which is about, this federalism is a way to manage this, right? Language or religious and linguistic differences. And so we talk about cantons and linguistic provinces and so forth. But that's not, in the southeast of Nepal, the mobilization for federalism, which is real, is about the fact that demographically over time, the economic center of gravity has shifted decisively to the southeast, that Hindi speakers are probably the largest ethnic group in Nepal, if not the majority, that they lack political power in Kathmandu, that in that kind of a country, it takes days to travel to Kathmandu by road, and it's a distant authority. And so this idea of kind of neglect and a failure to acknowledge economic reality is a lot of what drives parties in the southeast, and what is towards federalism, and what sustains those parties. It's this kind of regionalism is not always about identity. It has, in that case, it kind of attracts a cleavage on the basis of language between those Nepalis who came from the Gangetic Plain in the 14th and 15th centuries, and those Nepalis who came in the 19th century. And so there is the cultural divide there, but what is at the root of this is a lot of it is economic.
Well, let me be provocative for a minute.
Yeah.
I think the only reason we're talking about group rights at the moment is because we're in the 21st century.
Yes.
We've been brought up in this liberal Western tradition.
Yes.
When most of Europe was going through a process of nation building in the 17th and 18th century,
right.
Group rights didn't matter.
Right.
It was about uniformity, one state, one language. It's a very famous book, making peasants into Frenchmen.
Yeah, Eugene Weber.
Eugene Weber.
Yeah.
And Japan, which is now considered one of the most culturally homogeneous countries in the world, also went through a process of state-sponsored homogenization.
Right.
I mean, is this? I'm being provocative by asking if this is no longer acceptable.
Well, the idea that a state would try to establish a basic set of sociological conditions in order for democratic politics to work, which includes the development of some notion of a shared sense of citizenship, some notion of a sense of shared identity, encouraging populations to integrate into at most two official languages, to participate in common institutions. That type of legacy of state building in the early modern period in Europe is very much a kind of it's a standard script that all states follow, right? And so if you look in the 50s and the 60s, I mean, in post-colonial Asia and Africa, this is a sort of a script that was followed in Eastern and Central Europe, right? After the fall of the Soviet Union, this type of nation-building script whose origins lay in, let's say, in Republican France in the 19th century, more centrally. It was followed. I think what's changed is the boundaries of what's acceptable and the ways in which one can deploy normative language and legal instruments to push back on and condition this type of nation building. The language of individual rights is a universal language. I mean, you see it everywhere. People might not use the language precisely how we do, but their grievances can be easily translated into it in a way that doesn't diminish their force or homogenize them.
We talked about individual rights, and I think this is, I want to build on that a little bit. Do you think individual rights could be one way of securing group rights without explicitly granting group rights? And I'm thinking here of the Canadian context, of course, where we conceptualize, to most of us, when we think of two official languages, we think in terms of group rights. But the courts have not interpreted it that way. It's always been, the interpretation has always been based on the right of the individual to receive services.
I mean, look, I think there's, good lawyers can craft a million ways to actually operationalize a group right. Who wields it? Is it an individual, a group of individuals, or a collective institution? And so I think there's no magic to how one juridically kind of constructs this beast, and there's a lot of trade-offs involved in different ways in putting these things together. I guess what I want to say is that there are some types of group rights that don't even look like rights. So I'll give you an example, right? So, in Canada, we've had debates over the years about electoral reform. We had a lot of debates about this a few years ago. And one of the big debates was over whether to move away from first past the post to a different type of electoral system at the federal level. And as I'm sure most folks here know, one of the findings in political science that is kind of pretty robust is that although first past the post produces disproportionality for large parties, for regional parties, it's a real win, right? Because they do extremely well if their votes are concentrated in a region. So the Bloc was very against any type of electoral system reform because it would completely change. It would have, at that time, led to a change in the character of Quebec's representation in the House. That's since happened. But at that time, public opinion polls looked very different than how Quebec's House representation did. So that type of entitlement, like the federal electoral system is something that is not just a matter of federal concern, the claims were made, well, that's our right, that's the way in which we participate in Canada. And it's in central institutions. It's not a group right in any sense that you and I would understand it, but it was but in terms of how it's understood and operated in this country, that is the way that is the language and framework within which people would look at that.
I think electoral politics is, a very important arena for the expression of group rights, and indeed, in sort of my line of work, federalization. Over lunch, we were talking about with the Nigerian High Commissioner. And he was complaining about Nigeria is now in its third constitutional convention, and they still don't have anything approaching organic democracy. And I think one of the problems is, you feel free to interject, and I'm comparing the Nigerian experience here with the Indian experience, where Nigeria, they have, by law, mandated national parties, which centralize executives that then tend to marginalize the representation of smaller states, whereas in the Indian system, with no thresholds, the emergence of regional parties has actually federalized the system further.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So political party regulation is not something that we, in most liberal democracies in the North Atlantic world, with exceptions in sort of Germany and Spain, pretty much anything goes, right? Okay, you can form a political party, a small one, a big one. That's not the case in most countries, right? In most countries, there are rules found in statute or in the Constitution that either have substantive policy bans or have national presence requirements, right? So in Russia, they also have a national presence requirement. And the interesting debates become about the trade-offs between those different strategies, right? So one argument is to say, well, we want people to participate in umbrella political parties. We don't want to have parties organized on the basis of ethnicity. So therefore, we should have X, Y, Z, right? So a national presence requirement is one of them, right? The flip side is that if those national parties aren't really genuinely ethnically inclusive, if they're actually dominated by the dominant ethnic group under the framework of being national and non-ethnic, then members of ethnic minorities might simply exit politics. And so the debate about ethnic party bans, it might become a debate about, or national presence requirements, might be a debate about whether groups that have been alienated from the political system, that maybe there might be a past of civil war or a history of insurgency, whether they feel it's worth their while to engage in politics or not. And so and how you make that judgment call is very case specific, right? But it's not to be done lightly,
Okay, I'm going to ask a policy question,
okay.
One that, this is something that all of us grapple with, you and I, when we're advising constitutional commissions and other such bodies. Most of the discussion so far on group rights has been in the context of diverse, multi-ethnic, multilingual societies. From a constitutional standpoint, how do you deal with group rights in monocultural societies?
Can you give me an example?
Tunisia, Egypt.
Right.
Same language. Yeah, there is a small Coptic minority, of course. But how do you institutionalize? Again, I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess those aren't the kinds of countries that I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about countries that are pluralistic, that are diverse, and where diversity has become the basis for political division, right? So that's not every place, right? Right. That's a certain set of countries, okay? And so the only point I would make is that, yeah, people talk about Egypt being, homogeneous, but it's not. There's a huge Shia minority. There's a huge Coptic minority.
Absolutely.
It's
Bedouins in the
Bedouins, right? Same with Libya, and these kind of repressed, mobilization on Berber identity, right? Or Azamari identity in Tunisia post-revolution, definitely in Libya, around Tuaregs. I mean, a lot of these countries are latent diversity has become very visible kind of in the post-Arab Spring period, and in the context of kind of weak states and political party systems that are immature and not very well institutionalized, and kind of security concerns, they've kind of taken on a salience that they might not have had a few years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah.